One moment we were driving to dinner, the next, that's me being loaded into an ambulance. A broken sternum, a broken clavicle.
Women get more hurt in car crashes, and I think I'd gleaned that from some kind of podcast.
They are 17% more likely to die compared to men. To fix this, Congress needs to pass the She Drives Act now.
Those were a few clips from a March 24, 2026 New York Times video opinion piece that I'll link in the description. In a nutshell, this woman was in a car accident with her boyfriend, his mother, and maybe somebody else, and as she states, the women in the car had more injuries than men. So now she's on a mission to force the auto industry to make cars safer for women. Today I'm going to break it down in reality because, as you can imagine, her entire message is built entirely on the 17% increased fatality statistic that she mentioned. So using data from the government and other sources, I'll show who's actually on the road more, how that 17% number was totally manipulated, and what the data show about automobile crash injuries and deaths between the genders today. The title of the New York Times video tells women to buckle up because cars aren't made for them. I'm telling you to buckle up because we're about to run her over like a deer in headlights.
It's time to all choose your timeline on the roller coaster of life.
I want to give a quick shout out to our growing group of YouTube channel and Patreon supporters. Thanks to all of you who are willing to invest a few dollars a month for the additional content on both platforms. It really does help, especially considering the amount of time that I put into making my content. Thank you all. Here's a couple more clips from that New York Times video that will help give an understanding of the propaganda behind it.
But it got worse. Turns out, the first person ever killed in a crash was a woman.
This incident happened in Ireland in 1869. That's nearly 40 years before the first Model T Ford came off the assembly line. It wasn't even a car, it was an early steam-powered carriage. And she was riding as a passenger, fell out of it, and was run over by one of its own wheels. It was not a crash, as this woman claims in the video.
The first person ever killed in a crash was a woman.
And check this out.
To find out, I read a couple books on the topic.
What she's reading here is a book titled Pink Cars and Pocketbooks: How American Women Bought Their Way into the Driver's Seat. That book is not even about car crashes, safety, or fatality risk at all. It's about advertising and consumer behavior, specifically how women became a target market for automakers. So how she's using it for research and evidence for modern auto industry safety disparities is an absolute joke. I could show more from this, but you get the point. Now that we have an understanding of the narrative around which the video is framed, let's discuss driving patterns between the genders. The fact is that men are simply on the road more, and not even by a small margin. And I'll be very conservative here. What I'll be referring to as we go along is people driving their own cars, whether it's commuting to work, a run to Kroger for a bag of Doritos, or maybe gig work like Uber or other job type related travel. All of that mileage is categorized as household vehicle use. What I'm not referring to here is things like commercial trucking, like long-haul semi-trucks or other heavy-duty commercial vehicles. I'm not including those as we continue. If I did include those male-dominated dangerous careers, the numbers that I'm about to talk about would be even more skewed. So here we go. The most cited U.S. data show men driving roughly 16,500 miles per year, compared to about 10,100 for women. That's a gap of over 6,000 miles annually, or roughly 35 to 40% more driving for men. That difference is even larger during peak working years, during which men average closer to 18,800, that's almost 19,000 miles a year, compared to about 11,400 for women. So before we even get into car crash risk or accidents or injuries, we need to understand that men are accumulating significantly more exposure to driving environments, especially in light of longer distances and higher speeds of travel that I'll expand on in just a moment. Again, keep in mind that we're being conservative here because the data reflects everyday driving in cars, SUVs, and light trucks, including work-related use of those vehicles, but not professional long-haul driving and trucking careers. Now, as far as the amount of time on the road, we have to estimate because hours of driving aren't directly reported by gender. Everything is typically by miles. But using a reasonable average of miles on highways and in cities, when we translate miles into time, the gap becomes even more tangible. And with a reasonable mixed driving speed of 30 to 40 miles per hour, that's roughly with men's 16,500 miles per year, it all works out to about 410 to maybe 550 hours behind the wheel annually. And using the same calculations, we see that women, they tend to be around, again, 10,100 miles per year that I mentioned earlier, and that falls closer to roughly 250 to 340 hours of annual driving time. So this is a substantial difference in time spent actively driving. On a weekly basis, that comes out to about 8 to 10.5 hours a week for men, compared to roughly 5 to 6.5 hours a week for women. And annually, that difference is 150 to 200 hours for men additionally, which is 8 full days in driving environments. That additional time means more exposure, not just to traffic in general, but also a wider range of driving conditions, including other vehicles who are responsible for traffic crashes. Diving in more closely to daily driving patterns shows the same disparities at a smaller scale. According to data from the National Household Travel Survey, men travel about 31 miles a day compared to about 26 miles a day for women. And these differences are also consistent across age spans. So men continue to spend more time and distance on the road, which compounds their total exposure to driving environments over time. And an interesting fact that I found is that even though women make up a slightly larger share of licensed drivers overall, men still account for a greater share of total driving exposure. Again, that's because men drive significantly more miles as individuals, which means they accumulate more time on the road and ultimately contribute larger proportions of total vehicles and miles traveled. And that gap in miles driven has been consistently explained by a few stable patterns, which I think are intuitive. For example, men are likely to have longer commutes and to drive as part of their work, whether it's in the trades, construction, delivery, or other job-related travel, which naturally increases total mileage and time on the road. So at the simplest level, men are driving more, which leads to increased exposure to traffic. With roughly 6,000 additional miles per year and about 150 to 200 more hours behind the wheel, that translates to men being exposed to about 50 to 60% greater exposure to driving environments. So let's talk about that approximately 17% statistic that this woman reported in the New York Times video.
They are 17% more likely to die compared to men.
And this is where the comment is sloppy and misleading. I'll put up overlays as evidence as I go, and the long list of sources are in the video description for anyone that wants to check those out. The widely cited 17 plus or minus 1.5% higher fatality risk for females comes from a 2013 report by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And I want you to remember that year, 2013, because it'll be important for some of what's coming up. The study was not a simple comparison of men and women on the road, but rather a controlled analysis to isolate death and injury outcomes within comparable crashes. In their analysis, drivers were matched by factors like crash severity, vehicle type, driver age, and even things like seat belts, seat position, and restraint use. These all helped to identify differences in injury outcomes under similar conditions. So the report stated that in comparable crashes, again, such as same road conditions, seat positions, ages, and restraints used, women had about a 17% higher fatality risk. And the report gives two main reasons or explanations for that. The first is basic body shape and size. That's things like differences in neck strength, bone density, and how body mass is distributed, all of which affect how force is absorbed during a crash. But the second and larger factor is vehicle design. For decades, crash testing and safety systems were built around the average male body, which is this woman's argument. And this includes safety features like seat belts, airbags, and seating geometry tending to align more closely with male body proportions. And as we can imagine, that mismatch can reduce the effectiveness of a lot of different safety features for women in certain crash scenarios. Now, I'm not going to disagree with that. Using female proportioned crash dummies is probably a good idea. But here's where it goes off the rails. The most important update that's conveniently left out of this argument by the New York Times is that the approximately 17% higher fatality risk for women is based on older vehicle data. Remember what year that report was published? It was 2013. And the 17% statistic that they gave was from well before 2013. In fact, more recent NHTSA analyses show that this fatality gap has been shrinking as vehicle safety technology improves, to the point at which in 2025 it's nearly non-existent. If you check the histogram here on the screen, which incorporates additional data from follow-up reports in 2022, in older vehicles, particularly those from roughly 1960 to 2009, women did, in fact, show about a 17% higher fatality risk in comparable crashes. But in newer vehicles from 2010 to 2020, that gap dropped to about 6%. And in the most recent vehicle models from 2015 to 2020, it falls to under 3%. So again, the real kicker here is that when the report was released in 2013, they were reporting on vehicle eras going back to the 1960s, when fatality differences were in fact much higher. But when it was published, newer data about improved outcomes was available at the time. And this video, which stated that 17% statistic from that 2013 report, in which used old and outdated data, was produced and published by the New York Times in 2026, yet still referring to data from the 1960s through 2009. The bottom line is that the New York Times published its work in 2026 without acknowledging that it was giving statistics from 30 to 60 years ago, and did not acknowledge that today there is virtually no difference in male and female fatalities comparable auto crashes. Now, before I get into a bit of commentary and why this is all feminist and political bullshit, let's talk about actual injuries and fatalities. Now, I'll go through these briefly so you don't get any more bored than you might already be. Direct breakdowns of severe injuries by gender are not always reported cleanly, but men account for the majority of fatal and high-severity crash outcomes, while overall injury counts are actually more evenly distributed between men and women. When we look at injury crashes per mile, the pattern flips depending on severity. Let me explain that. For non-fatal crashes, estimates often show women slightly higher per mile, while for fatal crashes, men remain significantly higher. Based on 2023 data in the United States, there were 40,901 annual traffic deaths. Men accounted for 29,584 of these, which is over 72%, while women represented less than 28% of traffic deaths. Using an alternate framing of fatal crashes per 100 million miles leads to the same conclusion, and that is that men have a substantially higher fatal crash rate than women, typically estimated at about 1.5 times higher per mile. The problem with feminist propaganda videos like this,
One moment we were driving to dinner, the next,
is that they selectively present outdated facts in a way that creates misleading narrative. And in this case, the narrative is that women are uniquely neglected in automotive safety. What they're not telling viewers is the reality of auto injuries and fatalities. It's all based on lies. The video leans heavily on false statements like women being more likely to be injured and the use of male-based crash test dummies. But it never addresses the most important variable in crash outcomes: men's injuries and fatalities. Men drive more miles. They spend more time in higher speed environments. They are more likely to be involved in severe crashes. But instead, the New York Times builds its case around emotionally manipulated and analytically weak points, like the first recorded car death being a woman, when she was not even in a car at all. She was a passenger who fell out of a steam carriage and got herself run over by its own wheel. That's how messed up this is. Modern safety systems are designed to protect a wide range of occupants, and more importantly, the real-world data show that men still suffer far more fatal outcomes overall. Even if there were current disparities in injuries and fatalities, what the hell do you want? You want automakers to build 10,000 different vehicles for every different body shape and size, from newborns to full-grown adults? Content like this constantly frames women as overlooked victims while ignoring the scale of male outcomes. As we learned, men make up roughly 70% of traffic fatalities in the United States, yet that disparity is totally ignored, while women's increased risk for fatality has virtually disappeared. So what we're left with is not about what can be done to make automakers and vehicles safer for women. It's not that at all. It's a narrative, and that narrative exaggerates women's risks while at the same time minimizing men's outcomes and ultimately reinforcing the same pattern we see across every other industry. Women's issues are highlighted as bad even when they're better than men's outcomes. Listen, ladies, you have the freedom to go and purchase different vehicles that are safest for women to drive. Do a little homework, figure it out. And hell, if men's larger body size is in fact a factor that leads to fewer fatalities per incident, many women in 2026 have nothing to worry about because they're bigger and they're less fragile than women were in the 1960s. They got thicker necks, more body fat, and bigger torsos. They're all just bigger these days, which probably reduces the chance of injury or death. Just saying. But even more frustrating is that this narrative is being used to justify legislation. The New York Times piece directly mentions the She Drives Act, which is designed to mandate expanded use of female crash dummies and reshape federal safety standards. And it's all bullshit.
Senators introduced the She Drives Act.
That would require NHTSA to update its testing devices for female and male crash test dummies.
We're releasing design specifications for this.
But I gave it a closer look. There's no deadline, no tangible action.
But that would only make sense if women were, in fact, still facing a meaningful, unresolved safety gap in modern vehicles. But that lie is exactly what the current data contradict. The entire push rests on a statistic pulled from older generation vehicles, as we saw. And at that point, we're no longer solving a systemic safety failure. They're trying to legislate a problem that has already been fixed through normal technological advancement. Hell, they're creating problems. And just think, it's some politicians and lobbyists' full-time jobs to get this legislation passed. It's our tax dollars paying salaries, and it's money given to causes that make absolutely no sense. I mean, other than pandering to women and rewarding them for distorting data to get sympathy for problems that don't exist. Meanwhile, the much larger and ongoing reality that men make up the vast majority of fatalities and severe injuries isn't receiving any legislative discussions. So what we're seeing in March 2026 is making up problems based on lies, where non-existent disparities become a legislative priority while a much larger one is totally ignored. Thanks again to our YouTube and Patreon members. Don't forget that there's a link below if you'd like to join them and get things like behind-the-scenes updates and research breakdowns that don't make it to YouTube. Cheers, my friends. I'll see you soon.